Hey everyone, and welcome to my Sony Xperia XA review. One of the nice looking smartphones on the market despite being a mid-ranger, but does have more to offer than just looks. Now for those of you who watched my Sony Xperia X review, you know that it was pretty unfavorable. So despite my name being an Xperia fan, you can count on me to give an honest opinion on this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with a brief overview of the phone, followed by things I dislike about it, and the things I like about it. So let's get right into it. On the front, you have a 720 5-inch screen, LCD, 294 pixels per inch. Internally, you have a MediaTek Helio P10 processor with 2 GB of RAM. On the rear, you have a 13 megapixel camera. And on the front, you have an 8 megapixel. This phone has a 2300 mAh capacity battery, 16 GB of internal storage with micro SD card support. It has a speaker at the bottom. And you also find a micro USB port with Quick Charge 2.0. So now for things I don't like about this phone. First, there's no fingerprint scanner. Now you do have a nice looking power button here, kind of the old school Xperia power button. But fingerprint scanner is really an excellent feature. For those of you guys who have them on phones, you know, it's hard to go back from not having that. And yes, this is a mid-ranger. That's going to be one of the themes of this video, is this being a mid-ranger. Obviously, it costs a lot less than a lot of other phones that do have fingerprint scanners, but there still are some mid-rangers with fingerprint scanners. So definitely would have been nice to have that. Next up, I don't like that this phone is not waterproof. Now again, it's hard to count as a negative because hardly any phones have waterproofing, especially mid-range phones. However, for Sony phones, it's pretty common, so still felt it was worth mentioning. Next, and this is a little bit more serious, the battery life on it is not very good. So as I mentioned, it's 2300 capacity, and it does have a new technology called adaptive charging, which is supposed to preserve the battery life over time. So you can get more charges out of this over time. But still, in day-to-day, it's really not good. Now note, it's not terrible. I would say it's a little bit below average for phones. But for Sony phones, it's definitely below average. And there's no way that you're going to get 2 days of use out of this. If you're using it pretty frequently, you're going to struggle to get for a full day with it. Next up is the speaker. So as I mentioned, there's just one at the bottom. And it's not loud at all. Definitely below average for phones that I've used. And also, unlike a lot of the other Sony phones, you don't have dual front-facing speakers, just one at the bottom. Now it is worth noting with headphones on, the sound quality is pretty decent, especially for a mid-ranger. And finally, I really don't like that the phone only has 16 GB of internal storage. Now only about half of that is usable, only about 8 GB is actually usable. So you're really going to go through this quickly. But that does lead me into the positives. The first one being that there's a micro SD card support up to 200 GB of storage. So I definitely suggest doing that. So micro SD card is definitely mandatory for this phone if you don't want to be constantly reading files. But it is great that there is the option for it. Next up, I love the interface on this. So pretty much standard Xperia. But Xperia is very close to stock Android, runs very smoothly. Very rarely have issues with it. And the few features that Sony does have on this are great. Also, I like that Sony doesn't put too much bloatware on this. And what they do have, you can delete. But generally, I find that the apps that are pre-installed, like the PlayStation app and the album app, are definitely good to have. Now, next up, and probably the best feature about this phone, is the design. So this has a beautiful edge-to-edge display. And it has metal on the sides. The only downside is the back is actually made of plastic. So I'll just show you a comparison versus the high-end X Performance. So you see this has a brushed metal back. Obviously a lot more premium, but then again it does cost a lot more. But to the XA's credit, I would say that if you're just looking at the front, I think the XA actually looks better. And the same is true versus the Xperia X. So if you just have these three phones on a table, just facing like this, I would think that the majority of people would definitely pick the XA as a nice looking phone. Mostly because of the edge display. As you can see, the X and the X Performance have a little bit of bezel on the side. Also, in addition, you see that the glass is curved. So it really transitions nicely to the metal on the side. And also very comfortable to hold. Really, this is one of the nicest phones that Sony's ever designed, with the only downside being the plastic on the back. But fortunately, there is a solution to that, and that is simply putting on a case, which probably most people do anyways. And I actually think it looks even nicer because now the edges completely disappear. Just show you a comparison versus the X with a case on. So here's the X. Again, you can see the big difference in the edges. And I definitely think that the XA looks nicer just from the front. And of course on the back, you can't notice the difference. Yeah guys, I really do think the design of the XA is one of the nicest of any phones, even the high-end phones. And if it just had a metal glass back, I think that it would be the nicest looking phone that I own. Next up, I really like the display in general, especially considering that it's just a mid-range phone. Overall, the display is very sharp, it has excellent colors, and also has great contrast. Now, it does have a few downsides, like it's only 720p. One of the negatives is that the viewing angles aren't great. You see that the colors become a little bit distorted. But again, overall, I think it's a great display, especially for a mid-range phone. Next up is the cameras. Now, the cameras aren't going to be as good as in the X and the X Performance, of course, but they're still pretty solid. So the 13 megapixel rear-facing camera provides sharp pictures with good dynamic range. You can shoot in 1080p at 30 frames per second. And more specifically, I do like the front-facing camera on this because 8 megapixels for a mid-ranger is pretty rare. Again, you can also shoot in 1080p on this, 30 frames per second. And it gives good colors and not too much noise in the pictures. So I say the front-facing camera is definitely above average with the phones I own, and great for a mid-ranger. Next up is the gaming and the performance of this phone in general. Now again, this is of course a mid-ranger, so don't go expecting it to be close to the high-end phones, but it really isn't that far off. In terms of sharpness, it's obviously not going to be as sharp. Graphics aren't going to be as good overall, but it is still pretty smooth. And I did run some speed tests versus the X Performance, and the results were pretty favorable. The X Performance is one of the fastest phones on the market, right up there with the S7 Edge, and it's really did not lag behind that much. In data usage and gaming, it definitely surprised me. Also, in the 2 weeks I've owned this phone, I've probably had any issues at all with it. Some Sony phones I've owned in the past, I've definitely had some issues with it, but with this, I really have not had any at all. So in conclusion guys, I have 3 of the X series smartphones on the table. One of them is $650, another one is $550, and one is $280. I don't think that many people would suspect on first impression that the XA is $280, because it does look very nice. So at least it has something going for it. It's a little bit ambitious, not many faults, the main one being the battery life. I mentioned at the beginning of the review I was more harsh on the X, and that's because the phone is very expensive. It costs more than the Z5, and it really doesn't have any standout features. With the X, however, I feel that the price is pretty reasonable. In the USA, as I mentioned, it's $280, but you also get a free micro SD card, 64 gigabytes. So it seems like a solid deal to me. So this phone certainly has its faults, especially with the battery. I do wish it was better, but then again, the phone might not be as thin. Also, would have been great if this had a fingerprint scanner on the side. But Sony did mention that the reason they're able to have the edge of the display on this is because it does not have a fingerprint scanner, like the X and the X Performance. So at least if they're going to not have a fingerprint scanner, there's a good reason not to. They have a good trade-off for it. And there are a few other negatives, but I feel overall the positives outweigh the negatives. And this is particularly true for the display, the design, the cameras, and the overall performance. Alright everyone, so thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe if you haven't already, because there's going to be a lot more Xperia XA videos coming, as well as the entire Xperia X lineup. And that includes the upcoming Xperia XA Ultra. Alright guys, so thanks again, and let me know what video you want to see next.